One.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Power Grid, of course, brought to you by the good people over at Footballguys and RotoGrinders.com. We're going to be with you, setting you up for another week of daily fantasy football. Three-man booth today. We got Devin Knotts and Mr. John Tip and Pick Lee from Footballguys. I'm Dan Bach. You can find all of our content, of course, at RotoGrinders for me and John and Devin over there at Footballguys. And certainly, if you're watching this video on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, leave us a nice comment. We certainly appreciate that. And if it's the podcast feed, also leave us a review on those podcasts, whether it's the Audible or the RotoGrinders daily fantasy football feed. Fellas, it's another week, and we've got COVID still out there. I am fairly convinced, Mr. Scientist here, John, and not to get all, political or whatever. I don't want to get in trouble with the viewers here, but am I wrong to say that I feel like everybody's going to get this strain of COVID that is going around right now? Like, I'm looking at the fact that it feels like 90% of the NFL has gotten it. I don't know how everybody doesn't get it, because clearly being vaccinated doesn't mean you're not going to get this Omicron strain. So that's my opening take here. We're all gonna get it.
And the warning label on YouTube has just arrived that we're talking about it, that we don't actually know anything about it. But John, go ahead.
John's a
scientist. It's all good.
Yeah. I don't know who may or may not know, but I do have a PhD in microbiology, immunology, so I know a little bit about this stuff. Is everybody going to get it? I think it's really contingent on your lifestyle and how protective you're being. Do I think that this Omicron is less dangerous? Probably, if you are at some level vacculated.
All I want to know is are the Ravens going to be able to field a team this week? Because they have like 8 guys on defense.
If you've got questions about Omicron, send me an email. My email's on the website.
There we go. Okay, sorry to get us off track in the first 20 seconds of this show, but it's just crazy because it's a way bigger deal this year than it ever was last year, and it's going to be like this for the next few weeks, and we're already seeing it with guys who, heck, there was games that we were talking about last week, and I feel bad because I was touting Duke Johnson. And then Myles Gaskin played, and I didn't play Duke Johnson. So I don't know. We'll try and get it right this week. John, give us the lay of the land. What do we got, as of this Thursday night in terms of the games that we want to focus on, and maybe if there's any games that could be in jeopardy. I don't know. I don't think we're going to lose any games this week, personally.
Yeah, we're not seeing the level. The NFL obviously changed some of their screening guidelines last week, and I think that's helped with some of the incidents this week. Obviously we're going to talk as we go through the positions, the folks who are in danger or not playing due to COVID, but largely I do believe we're going to see, I think it's an 11 game slate, if I'm not mistaken, as opposed to a 9, what ended up last week. In terms of Vegas this week, it's always a little bit interesting. Not a lot of scoring this week.
No.
The highest implied team total on the main slate board is LA Chargers, and they're going up against Houston's terrible defense. They're 10-point favorites, and so you would say, wow, we really like Austin Eckler this week, but Austin Eckler has come down with COVID. And so Justin Jackson, who I think is 4,200, is going to be somebody who I think everybody's going to have in cash games for sure. We'll talk about the strategy and the approach you should take in tournaments here in just a bit. But the Chargers are at the top of the slate, and after that, it drops off a little bit. You've got Tampa Bay on the road and the Rams on the road against Minnesota. Both of them are around 26 points. One of them is a 10-point favorite. That's Tampa Bay. And, oh, by the way, they're missing somebody in the form of Leonard Fournette. Normally we like those big favorites when they have a running back. So you're going to be running it out in the second half, and now you got Ronald Jones. So one of the themes you're going to see here shortly is that we've got some cheap running backs this week, and I think that creates an interesting game strategy perspective for tournaments that we can talk about when we get there. After that, I'm looking at the Vegas value chart. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 home favorites after that. And I suspect for tournaments, you're going to need one of these teams to perform above what Vegas is projecting. And, just for the sake of discussion, you've got Kansas City, Philadelphia, Seattle, Atlanta against Detroit, which is interesting, Cincinnati, Minnesota, and New England. So New England and Buffalo is an interesting game from my perspective. You've got two purportedly good defenses, but also some decent offenses there. I think I use the word interesting a lot when I talk about Vegas, but this is a week where a combination of understanding that the most popular game on the board, that being the Rams in Minnesota, may not be the one that's going to win you the GPPs this week, simply because there's a lot of game strategy involved in roster construction and how you approach GPPs.
Yeah, I mean, Devin, I think we talked a little bit before the show that this is setting up to be a pretty chalky week. I think there's going to be obvious value. Then when you have such obvious value, that's going to filter us to, roster the studs that, give us 25 fantasy points every single week, like Cooper Kupp does. So, it's kind of all works together here in that front. So I think in cash games, you might even see some duplication, but we also know that things can change right up until roster lock. And like one game in particular is this Kansas City game where at last look, the Chiefs were 8-point favorites in this game. And for me, I don't know. What do you think about this? Like, should the Chiefs be an 8-point favorite if Kelsey and Hill don't play in this game? Because I don't think they should be. And maybe what we're hearing from this is that at least the odds makers think that those guys are probably going to play.
Yeah, but has anyone come back in the same week? It seems like people are eligible, but I don't know if they actually have. John, you may know it better than I have. Like, they've changed the rules, but I don't think anyone who was diagnosed last week came back and played in the same week or were taken off the list. So I think Pittsburgh's run defense is bad enough that they could run the ball 30, 40 times and get away with it. I think that Patrick Mahomes is good enough and Pittsburgh's offense is bad enough. So I don't know. I tend to think that
you think it's a little high with those guys out.
I'd probably have it at 7, but we're splitting hairs here.
Okay.
It's still Kansas City. I mean, their defense has been really good as of late. Is it at Kansas City?
Yes.
Yeah. So Arrowhead's one of the best stadiums in football. So yeah, it's probably about right. Maybe 6.5, 7 is where I would have it. But
we'll see. Yeah,
you could be right though. I mean,
and it could be like a hedging situation. Maybe if those guys play, it goes to like 9 or 10, and if they sit, it'll drop a point or two. I don't know.
If they were playing, it's probably 11.5, 12. Pittsburgh's really bad.
True. I mean, and again, this is about DFS, not betting, but I just think that's the point that we're looking at, though, is I think that especially after last week where the lines yo-yoed back and forth like we've never seen before, I think they're trying to get ahead of it because that's a tough spot for them to be in.
I mean, they don't know what they're doing either. There's no precedent for this. There's no model that can explain what we're doing here with COVID and the history behind it. We're all trying to figure it out together, and I think there was a huge middle in the Browns game that you could have very easily hit. So anyway, quarterbacks.
Quarterbacks. Let's go there. And, this is a position, I think there's a couple, obviously there is some COVID that's going around at this position, but, the Saints aren't on the slate, so we don't have to worry about Ian Book. I know you were looking forward to that. You get to do that in Showdown. But what are you looking at this position? Because I think there's a number of ways. We got, potentially 3 or 4 guys that I think could fall at like 10% ownership or higher.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting this week because I actually think for how bad this slate is, and we just spent 9 minutes talking about it, that there's a lot of options at quarterback this week. And I think that that's really where it's going to be won or lost. So in cash, I think there's a couple guys that you could probably think about. And I know that there's going to be a certain quarterback that I'm sure John is going to talk about that's probably popular facing the Giants. But I'm going to start with Matthew Stafford I think that this game has sneaky shootout potential going up against Minnesota. Minnesota's defense isn't great. But what's surprising is that the Rams' passing defense hasn't been great either. They've allowed 3 of their last 7 opponents to throw for 300 yards. I think that this could be the back and forth game of the week. It's in Minnesota, so you don't have to worry about the weather, which should help both of these offenses. I'm starting with Matthew Stafford. If there's another guy that I was looking at, it would be Justin Herbert. The only thing that I worry about there is playing at Houston. They have some COVID issues with Austin Eckler. Do they need to throw the ball as much as Matthew Stafford might? So is Herbert going to throw for 300 plus? I would worry about that a little bit. If he loses one of these receivers, like it could just spiral a little bit. But I'm starting with those guys. I know that Jalen Hurts is going to be popular. I'm not doing it in cash. I think that it's too risky. You're relying too much on a running quarterback, and he doesn't produce enough with his arm. John, anything here?
I mean, you mentioned both of the guys that I'm looking at in cash, and that's Justin Herbert, 7,200. It's it's a week where there's a lot of value that's opened up, and we'll talk about the value as we get through the show. I think you can spend 7,200 at quarterback this week and not feel bad about the players you're selecting thereafter. To the point that you made around whether or not Herbert's got the floor, probably for cash games. We can talk about the upside in a minute, but the floor, I'm looking at his game logs here, and over the past 3 weeks, he's blown out 2 teams by 20-ish points. And in both of those weeks, he's thrown for 3 touchdowns, one of them for 300 yards, the other for 280. So,
that's fair.
I think he's got the upside. It's a team that likes to throw the ball a lot. And with Austin Eckler out, maybe they just resort to throwing. So he's a guy I like. And then the other guy I do like that you've already referenced is Jalen Hurts. He's played some really good football of late. They're running the ball quite a bit, or he's running the ball quite a bit, I should say, trying to pull the game logs up on the fly here. But in the games that he started, he scored 2 touchdowns on the ground last week, 8 carries. Before that, 8 carries. Before that, 18. Before that, 14. Before that, 10. So he's getting a lot of action on the ground. He's 6,400 this week on DraftKings, going up against the Giants at home in a game they absolutely need to win for playoff contention. So there's a lot of motivation. We're entering that time of the season where these things become more and more important. So I think those are the ways that I'm considering going for cash. I think for GPPs, we can talk about a different direction. And I'll even say for tournament play, I might be fading Herbert, depending on how popular he gets. And kind of in line with what you were talking about, Devin. I don't want to speak out of both sides of my mouth, but when we start talking about tournaments, that's where ownership and popularity really comes into play in game strategy. And I think that because of the value that's going to open up this week, there may be a reason to think about fading Herbert. We can talk about some of the other quarterbacks. I don't know if there's anybody that's at the top of your radar.
Yeah, well, I think I agree with you for tournaments too. And I think part of that really depends on how much you are a believer in this like running back chalk that we're going to get to, the Ronald Jones, the Justin Jackson, those type of guys. Because if you're a big believer in that, I think you definitely want to look somewhere else at quarterback. And I think you look at some of these percentages, John. I mean, you mentioned, and I'm surprised you didn't bring it up already because you seemingly used to talk about him all the time. But, Matt Ryan right now is in a game at home against Detroit with a 24 team total. And if there's ever a spot for him to kind of finally have a Matt Ryan-esque game, this feels like it. And we're at like sub 2% right now. Early in the week. And I think there's a lot of guys that kind of fall into that bucket, whether it's a Cousins, maybe even a Russell Wilson against Chicago. I think that all these guys are going to be really, really overlooked this week. And I think they're, something like that could likely spike in a lot of these tournaments and be the key to winning.
Joe Burrow is the guy I'm looking at around 3.5 to 4% rostered. Baltimore has 12 defensive players on their roster right now, total. They're missing 6 defensive backs. They're missing their top 3 defensive backs. We've seen Tyler Huntley not be completely terrible. Joe Mixon's questionable. So, like, is he 100% healthy? He's going to play, but is he 100% healthy? I think that this game, Burrow could take advantage of this secondary. I understand that they could run it and they could just have a lead the entire time, but that's factored into the 3% roster, right? I could make the case that Matt Ryan has thrown for under 200 yards in 5 of his last 7 games. That's factored into the ownership. It's all factored in, right?
One of the few props that are out is Joe Burrow. What would you take a guess that his passing yards are sitting at?
255.5.
269.5. It's actually pretty high.
Yeah. I mean, for a 3% rostered quarterback, that tells you he has a chance to go over 300. So I like that one quite a bit.
Yeah, I like it too. I think it's a decent call. It's not one I had in my list, but Tyler Boyd is one of the guys that I was going to talk about it at the wide receiver position for GPPs. And anybody who's watched the show long enough knows that a lot of my quarterback exposure is driven by how much I like wide receivers. So from that end, Tyler Boyd is going to drive me towards Joe Burrow. I like the call. The quarterbacks on my tournament list this week, I mean, I get we've got a couple decent defenses, but is Vegas off on this New England Buffalo game? Could this be a high scoring shootout? I mean, we got a quarterback in Josh Allen. That's the guy I want to talk about. You've got Stephon Diggs, Cole Beasley, COVID, big surprise there, right? Gabriel Davis, who served me well in cash games last week. I think I talked about him on the show. And then Isaiah McKenzie is going to be 3,000. Dawson Knox continues to do Dawson Knox things, underrated. Outside of Stephon Diggs, there's a lot of value there in terms of the likelihood to reach GPP value versus their implied ownership. So I think Josh Allen, he's popping for me tonight on Thursday night. We'll see what happens going into Saturday, but he's a guy I like this week. And I could see that game going back and forth. I could also see it being, to be fair, I could also see it going the opposite way. But I think that the delta there is pretty large. Another game that I got 2 other quarterbacks on my list, and they're both going to be controversial.
That little smile just has me has me knowing what's coming or something ridiculous. But go ahead.
Both of them are potentially ridiculous. One has already been mentioned, and if not mentioned, maybe mentioned before the show. Tyler Lawrence against the Jets at 5,000. All the receivers.
John, no.
All the receivers come up hot. Okay. All right.
They've come up hot like every weekend.
Dude, did you see what happened against Houston last week? Like, no.
We're talking tournaments here.
Don't do it. You could get like Kirk Cousins at the same like level.
He's not cheap enough.
Don't do it. Like, yeah. If
he's
was like $4K, maybe.
And I'm actually more worried about my next selection.
It's Drew Lock, isn't it?
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's Ben Roethlisberger at 5,500. If the Kansas City Chiefs do their thing, because the thing about, if you watch the Steelers, I was hoping that Ryan would be on the show tonight because I really wanted to ask him this. The Steelers typically play down to their opponent. When they play a big opponent, and I'm generalizing here, but when they play a big opponent, they show up. And I wonder whether or not this is one of those games where Big Ben, they fall behind. He throws for 300 yards. You've got Chase Claypool, who nobody wants to play because of what he did a few weeks ago. Deontay Johnson, you got Ray McLeod. Nobody wants to play these guys. And I kind of think that they're going to be sneaky in tournament formats. And I think that there's a stack that you could do here with, we'll see what happens, because right now Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce are both in COVID protocol. I mean, Byron Pringle's been playing a lot of snaps. He's not done a whole lot with those, but if they're out, then he's going to have to do something. And maybe to Devin's point, I think he said it earlier, there might be a running back play here. If they're 11-point favorites or whatever, 11, 7.5, depending on where you go, it's actually pretty widespread. Ben Roethlisberger, maybe he wins us a tournament on his way out because he's only got 3 games left. Maybe there's some motivation there to put a stamp on some things.
I'm more okay with Roethlisberger than I am Trevor Lawrence. Or as you said, Tyler Lawrence, but that's a whole nother thing.
Tyler. Oh, yeah, Tyler. Thank you.
All right, let's move on to running back. And, John, you kind of alluded to it already about, the injuries that we have. Ronald Jones going to be the lead ball carrier for a team with the highest total out there, but he's 5,100 there on DraftKings. And then Justin Jackson as well, likely toting the rock for the Chargers, but definitely obviously follow the news in case Eckler does return. And those guys right now, 27-23, we're expecting to be rostered percentage-wise. And then we throw Alexander Madison in there. Now, he's juiced up a little bit, and we've got him at 25%. I don't know if he's going to hit that level, but he's been pretty good this season in these games where Dalvin Cook has been out. And, of course, Cook hit the COVID list today, so pretty certain he's not going to play. How do you rank –
Madison's going to be like 75% rostered on FanDuel because he's 5,500.
Okay, that's a stone cold lock. So, how do you kind of rank these guys? And then let's throw James Robinson into the mix too against the Jets, who literally everyone, even Duke Johnson, can run well against the New York Jets. How do you rank these guys in terms of like your favorite play? And we got to kind of look at salary in this discussion too. Robinson 59, Jackson 4.2, Ronald Jones 5.1.
For me, it's Jackson, Jones, J-Rob in that order. And I think that's consistent for both cash and GPPs based on what I'm seeing on ownership as of today. That could change going into the weekend, but I guess I probably should point out Justin Jackson is above and beyond the other two. The other two are pretty close. Justin Jackson is pretty high at 4,200.
I am taking James Robinson first. I am
too.
I want every running back who's facing the Jets, but I'm also playing Justin Jackson as well at 4.2. I think that's too good of a price. And then the third question is, do you play Ronald Jones? And I think the answer is probably yes in cash, and you just play all 3 of those guys and you move on. Now, should you play those in GPPs? I don't think you probably should. I think 1, if not 2 of those guys are going to bust, but the Jets have allowed 25 touchdowns to running backs this year. It's just completely absurd. They're allowing 35 DraftKings points per game to the position. It's just absolutely nuts how bad they've been against the running back position.
So they're due to show up is what you're saying, and therefore
they showed up.
Trevor Lawrence could be an excellent GPP value.
No. Robinson, he had 6 targets last week, 18 carries, and a negative game script against Houston. He's the total smash. I'm with you, Devin. I think he's number 1. I think I like him better than even Justin Jackson in this game because Jackson's great. Like, he's fine. Salary's great, but it could easily just be a situation where it's Keenan Allen and it's Mike Davis, and they do it through the passing game. So the Jags have no passing game, John. They have nothing.
Trevor Lawrence is spiking balls in front of receivers. He just looks completely out of sync.
I agree, guys. I've watched him play. He does not look good, but the price reflects it, and it's the Jets.
He's not cheap.
So, yeah.
Last week Tyler Huntley won the Millionaire Maker. Would any of you got on record saying Tyler Huntley was going to win the Millionaire Maker?
Anything's possible. You could run for 3 touchdowns. You could run for 3 touchdowns.
We're talking about GPPs, not cash games.
Okay, we're on running backs.
Okay, let's talk GPP here. So, okay, of those guys, are you telling me Jackson's the one? Like, who's your biggest fade out of those 3 in GPPs?
It depends on where they end up in terms of ownership. Where does RotoGrinders?
I think they'll all be like 20. Let's say they're all like 25 to 30, because I think you nailed the cash game build. You play those 3.
Yeah.
So I think they're also going to kind of translate into GPPs because people are going to at least play one of the 3 in most of their lineups. So I'd say like 30+% on all of them potentially.
So if as things go, I'm looking right now. I've got them all somewhere between 22 and 25%. And Justin Jackson is the guy that my model's saying I should have 72.8% Justin Jackson exposure in terms of my, I do 150 lineups. So what I don't know what the math is there. 120 of them will have Justin Jackson as of Thursday night. The other two are hovering somewhere around 40% based on the numbers that we've quoted so far.
Devin, what about you? Who's your plant or putting your?
I'm probably fading
Ronald
Jones, just because. Could they involve Keyshawn Vaughn? Could they involve? They're not going to involve Le'Veon Bell, but could they involve some of these other receivers? I don't know if Rob Gronkowski's playing. I think he is.
He is. Yeah,
he is. So like he could catch 2 touchdowns. I think there's other ways for Tampa to move the ball. Justin Jackson's just really cheap, and I want to play James Robinson pretty much everywhere.
And the question is, Tampa Bay, there's another player on this team that's going to be extremely highly popular, and that's Antonio Brown.
Yeah.
And do you want to? I mean, you can spend $10,000 because I think that's what they add up to on DraftKings. You can do that, but then you're kind of locked into the Tom Brady, Antonio Brown, Ronald Jones stack, which isn't bad, but it's going to be super popular. It might be the most popular. This is what I was talking about, the Vegas value, when we were talking about opening up the show with the Vegas value chart. There are builds this week that are going to drive you in a certain direction. If you have Tom Brady and you have Ronald Jones and you have Antonio Brown, you're almost assuredly then going to go towards Cooper Kupp.
Yeah.
And, because you spend down, you're going to look for somewhere to spend up. And it's going to be a really difficult time differentiating your roster based on that build. So, I would caution our listeners, our viewers, to really think about that, especially when we're talking about large filled GPPs. Maybe you can get away with it in a single lineup entry, but just be careful.
I think that's a very good point there, John. Other guys that we've got at this position, because we can get different, we can get a little crazy here. Devin, give me some names that you're looking at.
I think David Montgomery's interesting. So he's caught 19 passes over his last 3 games, really involved in the passing game, which sort of what you're looking for with David Montgomery. He's not like the best running back. He's not going to run for 140 yards. You're hoping for 2 touchdowns or, 6-7 receptions. I think Chicago fights a little bit in this game. Seattle doesn't look like they're all that motivated. They sort of had a last stand last week against the Rams. Their season's over. It hasn't gone nearly the way that they had hoped. They're all sorts of banged up on their defensive front as well. So I think David Montgomery's interesting. I think Cordero Patterson going up against this Detroit Lions defense. They can't stop anybody against the run. They're similar to the Jets in that manner. Patterson historically has gone a little underlooked for most of this season. So I do think that he's a way to differentiate your lineups at 6,700. And then I talked about it a little bit. Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh is allowed, let me pull up the stat here, but over their last 2 games, they're allowing 208 yards rushing per game. They've completely fallen off ever since DeAndre Swift tore them apart back in week, I think, 10. So Clyde Edwards-Helaire could be a guy that is interesting this week, knowing that there might not be a Tyreek Hill, knowing that there might not be a Travis Kelce. Are they really going to be able to move the ball through the air with Mecole Hardman and Byron Pringle and these other guys, or are they going to have to lean more on the running game with Pittsburgh having some COVID issues on the defensive side of the ball as well?
Interesting. One name to bring up. I think you could maybe look to Sony Michel in tournaments too. He got like 80% of the snaps last week, and Minnesota, one of the worst defenses against in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running backs over the last 4 weeks. So they've really fallen off, and it certainly appears that it looks like you're going to see Sony Michel necessarily carry some of that load. So nobody's probably going to play him because they're thinking Henderson might get more run, but I was pretty impressed with the workload that he got in that game. John, give me a name or two before we move on to the wide receivers.
For tournaments, I'll give you one name, Devin Singletary for the Buffalo Bills. The last 2 weeks, 82%, 93% of the snaps. Not very often you get that kind of, snap count or snap share, team market share in the NFL in 2021, nearly 2022. And he's at a price at 5,100 that I think he's a sneaky play this week. I don't know where RotoGrinders has him, but I'm looking at my my preliminary numbers here, and I've got I want to say
4%.
What do you have him at?
4%.
He's a heck of a play if he stays there. He should be closer to somewhere between 12 and 15%. If he stays below any of those numbers, then you need to go overweight on him this week in a matchup that I've already talked about. I think that game is intriguing. I think it could play higher than what Vegas thinks.
Any interest in Mixon there, Devin? I know you mentioned Baltimore's defense being banged up. You like Burrow. Probably not playing him with Burrow, but I guess you could go Cincinnati onslaught. But in terms of like big name players, because here's the deal, like these names that we're talking about are trash. Ronald Jones, Justin Jackson, James Robinson, David Montgomery. These aren't the guys that we're, used to be able to play and have, expectations that we're going to get, big games. Joe Mixon's a guy who we've seen a lot this year be on winning tournament lineups. Any interest in him this week at 69? Because there's value to be had. Like you say, you could play two of those guys and still be able to fit him in.
I think it depends. So we really need to see what happens with this Baltimore defense. They've been a top 5 run defense really for most of the season. And they shut down Nick Chubb twice, 2 weeks in a row. They shut down Aaron Jones last week. They shut down Najee Harris a couple weeks ago. So it's still TBD. If guys like Calais Campbell are out or other defensive linemen are out for Baltimore, then I have some interest. But right now with Marcus Peters, Marlon Humphrey, Jimmy Smith all out, Baltimore even before that was allowing the most passing yards per game. That may have changed since last week, but heading into last week they were. I'm looking it up right now. They're second in the NFL in terms of passing yards allowed, only to Seattle. So banged up secondary or COVID secondary. I'm targeting primarily the passing game this week.
All right, let's talk about those wide receivers. Before we get to the obvious Cooper Kupp, Devin, I'm going to stay on that. How do you rank the Cincinnati wide receivers? Because that's, the toughest question week in and week out with this team. Who is the one that's going to go off? How do you choose really between Chase, Higgins, and Boyd here?
Do they make a 3-sided coin? I think like most things, it's going to come down to ownership and price. So if I look at ownership, it looks like Jamar Chase is going to be the most popular, followed by T. Higgins, and then followed by Tyler Boyd, which is somewhat surprising considering when was the last time Jamar Chase had a great game. It's been, I guess he had one a couple weeks ago, but
he did nothing last week. Literally,
yeah, he did nothing. But I'm looking.
He's gonna go off. This is a classic.
I think
DraftKings, this is classic. Coming off of one fantasy point, and he's juiced up now to 7,100. His salary did not fall at all from last week. Chase is gonna have a good game here. That's what I think.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm paying for Tyler Boyd. Coming off of his 5 for 96 and 1, it feels. I know John's gonna. I know he loves Tyler Boyd week in and week out, so I'm gonna avoid that. But Tyler Boyd is the third option in this offense.
Yeah,
I think Higgins is the most consistent player, even though he's had, he struggled the last couple weeks. I think Chase is the guy that has 140 yards and 2 touchdown potential.
Yeah,
that's the guy.
He's a tournament winner. You're right.
Yeah.
Boyd ain't winning you a tournament. I agree. John, you seem to have interest in Cooper Kupp like the rest of the world here. So give us your thoughts on how we approach him because, real quick for cash games, it's Cooper Kupp, it's Antonio Brown. Those are the two guys that you're playing. And then we can talk about third options here in just a moment. But I want to make that very clear. Those two guys are borderline locks. I think Antonio Brown's probably the best play on this slate with everything that's happened and the fact.
How did they screw up his pricing so bad?
I don't know.
It's a suspension. They should know when he's coming back. Like it shouldn't be that hard, guys. I'm going off of
7,100.
I'm like the pricing police.
And Chris Godwin was, measurably hurt. We knew that he probably wasn't coming back.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Terrible. So those two guys, I'm sure we're in agreement. So talk about them and also your thoughts on tournaments, because I know you said you got some just talking points about Cooper Kupp you want to get to.
Yeah. So Antonio Brown to me is the second best player on the board, Dan. The best we've already talked about, that's Justin Jackson, but I'm not going to split hairs over that. I think he's a great play this week, especially if he stays where I'm seeing him projected right now, somewhere between 15 and 20%. I suspect he's going to get a lot higher than that, right?
Yeah, way high.
But yeah, Cooper Kupp in cash games, lock him in. You've got the money because you're saving a bunch of it at the running back position. You've already heard Devin talk about how cheap Alexander Madison is over there on FanDuel. So you're playing cash games there. You can do the same thing. Get away from whoever the difference is between those two sites. Those are the two guys in cash game. The other two guys I have on my cash game list, I won't talk about them. I'll just reference their name because I think the more interesting thing here is to talk about game strategy with respect to Cooper Kupp. Cash games, Cooper Kupp, 9,100. If you have the money, I like Justin Jefferson at 8,100. I don't know that you can get there, but if you can, with the questions, happening at the running back position, in a game that is the highest total on the Vegas board, I like that. And then monitor what happens at practice on Friday. That's tomorrow. We're recording this on Thursday night as always. But if DJ Moore is inactive, Robbie Anderson, I think, gets a big uptick at 4,900 because, the next receiver in line there is Brandon Zylstra, who I believe most of us probably don't know much about. I think he's a lock at 4,900 if we don't get any action from DJ Moore on Friday tomorrow at practice. The question, guys, is what are we going to do with Cooper Kupp in tournaments? He's 9,100. I've got him as of tonight at about 17% likely to reach GPP value. Now, anybody who's been following football guys long enough, they know what H value is. And H value, basically, it's a weighted value for cash games and GPPs that gives more weight to a player who's got a higher salary because you're just getting more bang for the buck, if you will. That said, I could see Cooper Kupp getting up to, 40+%. Is that off base? Do you guys think that that's off base this week?
No, I think FanDuel gets over 50 with all the value that they have.
And there's a lot on DraftKings too. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, if Antonio Brown wasn't there, so obvious at 4,900, maybe not, but yeah, I'm with you. I think 40% easily.
If he gets to 40%, I'm gonna hate myself for doing it, but I'm likely going to go 10%, and I may X him out of my GPP lineups. Simply because that team is a good team. They've got a lot of talent. They've got a multiple running backs. You've got Tyler Higbee at tight end. You've got Van Jefferson who's made some big plays. Odell Beckham. Any of those guys, if they score 2 or 3 touchdowns, the implied team total for this team is 28. It's not like it's 42. There's only 4 touchdowns to go around if you believe Vegas. And this guy's 9,100, 40, maybe even 50% rostered. The right move, whether or not it works out, is to fade him if he gets that high.
The problem is Minnesota this season, most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, and Cooper Kupp is having by far the best wide receiver season out there. It's a tough fade. So I mean, not everybody's playing 150. So let's do it in this fashion, because a lot more people who are watching and listening will play single entry or 3-entry max. Does that apply to that as well, John? Are you more apt to fade him in 3, say, 150 lineups or $150 lineups, or the 3-entry max $5, or in single entry, do you just try to win somewhere else? What's your feeling there? Are you more likely to fade it there?
It likely depends on how big the field is. First off, if it's above 20K,
it's a big one. One of the bigger single entry or 3-entry max.
If it's above 20K entries, I'm fading him. Period. Okay. If it's less than that, then maybe I'll go like 1 entry with Kupp just to kind of cover my butt. If it's a 3-entry, I'll take one of them. Yeah. But I really believe from a game strategy perspective this week, and I said this last week, it ended up not mattering, but I really believe that the right move is to probably fade him as much as it's going to hurt. And I love this guy. He's one of my favorite players in the NFL. But my head, thankfully, does not dictate what my heart does.
Well, my head's going to explode here in a second. Look,
all right, go ahead.
Look, my problem is, like, where else are you going to go? Who else has the upside that Cooper Kupp does? There's not a running back over 7K that I want to play. There's only one that's actually active, and Najee Harris is, don't even get me started. But you could go Justin Jefferson. You could go, like, there's not these top end guys that you could pivot off to. And that's my biggest problem is, like, is your model taking into consideration that this could just be a lower scoring week and Kupp just dominates everyone? I think you can get different by fading those running backs that we talked about. I think you can get different at the quarterback position. I think you can get different at other positions that I would rather do than fade a guy who seemingly is scoring 30 plus DraftKings points almost every week.
Look, I'm going to disagree with you from a game strategy perspective, but from a 16 weeks in a row he's done it. Yeah, it's hard for me to say you're wrong. So you're looking at it as on a percent basis on the 20% off chance that he doesn't have a great game, where I'm looking at it like, if I'm giving someone advice, if you're okay with losing because of Cooper Kupp and you don't want your Christmas ruined, fine. But on the chance that he does have a bad game, you're in a very, very, very good position. And that's where you –
But Devin, it's also like, John, you can also, though, get cute and play your Ben Roethlisberger, who nobody else is going to play, with Deontay Johnson, and play Cooper Kupp and still be super unique. And I think that's where, if you're fading Cooper Kupp, like, some of that's got to be dependent upon, like, what else you're playing.
Dan, you're 100% right. And everybody should have hopefully rewind that if you didn't hear that. That's exactly what people should be doing. If you want to play Cooper Kupp, then the rest of your lineup needs to be very unique, because otherwise it's going to be really difficult to finish in the top 10%. And if you're playing in a GPP, that's where you want to be. But, I want to make sure that I go on record here that I always play what I talk about on this show. And as of tonight, I will be underweight on Cooper Kupp on Sunday. And if that changes, I'm actually writing an article this week. So I want to make a plug there that on Football Guys this week, our friend Phil has had some family issues, and I'm going to take over and try to fill his shoes. And so if you read DKK Domination this week, that will be what is it called? Pen authored? What's the I don't know.
Penned or authored probably works in terms of.
I'll be the one writing that. So you'll see where I land Friday or Saturday on that front.
All right, let's get some more guys here that we can consider, and let's first talk about Tyreek Hill, Devin. If he doesn't play, what are we doing here? Is there any receiver that we can look at on the KC side of things that you think some of those targets are going to get funneled to?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I mean, the two contenders are Mecole Hardman and Byron Pringle. I tend to lean Hardman. I don't really have like a strong lean to it, but at 3,500, we've seen Hardman do it more. I feel like Pringle is I feel like, man, this is not a strong take at all. The coin told me that it was Hardman. No, I'm joking. But I feel like Pringle is more of just like a possession receiver where Hardman has the speed to break something long, but that's entirely like speculative, and I don't have a strong play. I think they're both in consideration. We really don't know because we haven't seen.
They're all super cheap too, by the way. Like the 8,400, and then it's 35, 33 for Hardman, Pringle, Josh Gordon 31, and then the rest 3K crappers.
Here's what I'll tell you. Here's what I'll tell you. I'm not playing Josh Gordon.
I knew you were going to say
that. So I'm eliminating him off the board. I know he's going to get somewhat popular. People are going to see the name. They're going to see no Tyreek Hill. They're going to see no Travis Kelce. And they're like, ooh, I remember this guy in 2013 when he was good 8 years ago, when John still had hair. But like, no, we're not playing Josh Gordon. So it's one of those two guys. Now, can I just talk about my cash game strategy real quick? So my cash game strategy this week really depends on Tyler Huntley. And we'll get into tight ends in a minute. We still have a couple of GPP names to throw out there. But if Huntley plays, I'm paying down at the wide receiver position, my wide receiver 3. And I'll talk about that in a second as far as why. If Lamar Jackson plays, I'm paying up for Justin Jefferson, and I'm paying down at the tight end position. I want Mark Andrews if Tyler Huntley is playing. And we'll talk more about that at the wide receiver or tight end position. Other wide receivers, I think Keenan Allen is interesting. I know he's expensive at 7,700. I don't know that you can get there. You certainly can't get there in cash, but with no Austin Eckler, they're going to throw the ball quite a bit to him. I think he has 10, 11, 12 reception upside in this game. So if you're looking at who can potentially supersede Cooper Kupp from a possession standpoint and a total catch standpoint, I think Keenan Allen could be that guy. I know John disagrees with me, so he's going to yell at me here in a second. And then Deontay Johnson. So if this game somehow shoots out, I think that he's interesting, sort of along the lines of the Ben Roethlisberger take. I don't know that you don't have to stack them. I think Johnson could be a standalone play. And then just going down the list a little bit more here. Hunter Renfrow in a tough matchup. I know that he's been popular several weeks in a row. I think people are going to be off of him, but he's one of the best red zone route runners that I've ever seen. And when they get down there, they're certainly targeting him. I don't think Josh Jacobs is going to have a lot of success this week. So those are 3 GPP names that I'm sort of looking at. John, I'll turn it to you, and you can yell at me as far as why I'm wrong about Keenan Allen.
I mean, Keenan Allen to me is just at that threshold, he's not the guy I want. I want Justin Jefferson, who I've already talked about, especially when I consider the likelihood for him to achieve GPP value versus the relative popularity. Jefferson is a superior play.
Don't disagree.
Yeah. Josh Palmer, by the way, is the guy on the Chargers that I like this week. If you don't like this, here.
No, why?
No, why?
He's not even on my radar.
No, there's so many better like no-name guys to play than him.
He's the third option.
I know. Exactly.
He's the guy that pops in my model right now. So take it for what it's worth.
I think my coin is a better model than your model.
Other names. These guys are all. I think we've talked enough about cash. We talked about Cooper Kupp. Keenan Allen's on my fade list, so we talked about that already. 3K-ish crappers. Dan always loves his 3K crappers for GPPs. For me, I've got a handful of them tonight. Nico Collins against the Chargers. If you're going to run it back on some sort of stack there, I like Nico Collins this week. Byron Pringle. Devin has already talked about the Kansas City passing game.
Not well, by the way.
I disagree with you, by the way. You said you kind of like Mecole. I think Mecole's got the superior athleticism, but if you look at the snap counts and the market share within that team, Byron Pringle has been winning out for most of the season, especially after, say, week 3. I think they've realized that Mecole is probably repetitive to maybe what Tyreek does. And then to that point, maybe that's the role that he fills this week if Tyreek doesn't play. But Pringle's 3,300. The other two are going to be commensurate with what we've already talked about at quarterbacks. I do at some level. I'm not going to have like 20%, so I'll be very clear here. We're talking 8 to 10%. I'm going to have Ray McLeod and Laquan Treadwell. Both of them. Treadwell, Dan, let's talk about Treadwell because we talked about him last week on the show. The guy has a real team market share. Let me look at this really quickly. Treadwell, over the past 5 weeks, market share within the team, which admittedly has not been a lot, but they're playing the Jets. I want to keep reminding people that. 13%, 20%, 18, 16, and 25% in terms of market.
A high percentage of trash is still trash.
And yet we're talking about James Robinson being a great play when he's had 13, 10, 14, and 17.
And what did he do last week when they finally got rid of Urban Meyer? They ran him 18 times in a game that they were getting crushed. They're gonna run. They're gonna run in that game, John.
Okay.
I'm telling you, don't waste your time on this passing game of the Jags.
I actually think Treadwell is a fine cash play. I don't know that he has the upside for a GPP.
Not even though. Like there's so many other three. I'd rather play Hardman in that spot over him, especially if there's no Tyreek. And I'd probably rather play Nico Collins over him, like you mentioned before. And what about Tyler Johnson? I mean, we know that Godwin's out. Evans is probably going to play this week. You got Antonio Brown. I mean, Tyler Johnson last week got 7 targets, and this is a potent offense that's supposed to score the most points out of any team on this slate.
Just to give you some perspective, Tyler Johnson, 4% likely to reach GPP value on a salary. Laquan Treadwell, 22%.
And that's with the thought that Godwin and obviously Godwin's out, but that Evans is out too.
Yeah.
I don't agree with that.
I don't think Tyler Johnson's very good, but Laquan Treadwell is not good either. So I mean, I'm fine with taking one of these Kansas City guys, pay up a little bit more to go to Gabriel Davis for Buffalo with no Cole Beasley. I think is a fine play, 4,600 maybe, something like that. He's been seeing an uptick in targets he's had 15 targets over the last 2 games. He's caught 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games as well. So if you want to play 1 or 2 lineups with it, Treadwell, fine, but I wouldn't play him in 20%.
I just can't think of a spot where he's going to win you a tournament. Like he's not going to catch you 2 touchdowns. There's no way.
The issue there, Dan, and this is where we're going to agree, is if you're playing some of the guys I just talked about, the 3K crappers with Nico, Pringle, Ray, whatever, you're likely pairing them up with a really expensive receiver. And if that expensive receiver is Cooper Kupp, they've got to be 3% owned because otherwise you're not getting uniqueness.
I'm going to give you one guy in the middle tier you didn't talk about who I think is pretty interesting. Russell Gage has seen 12 targets in 2 of the last 3 games, 18 DraftKings points in 3 out of the last 4. And he gets Detroit. Obviously, Ridley's still out. He's getting the market share in the pass game. 24 team implied team total. I think you can do worse than Russell Gage at 5,900. So there you go.
He looked really good last week.
He's been good.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen's agreement for tight end since Phil isn't here. We're not talking Kyle Pitts this week.
You won't hear from me.
Okay. Let's go to tight ends.
Okay. Mark Andrews, you've already mentioned it. Devin, he's the guy that you're prioritizing. I'll take it.
Yeah, I mean, look, if seemingly every pass from Huntley is going the way of Mark Andrews. He's had 21 receptions over his last 2 weeks with Huntley as the quarterback. 250 yards and 3 touchdowns. So he's basically Cooper Kupp at the tight end position with Tyler Huntley as a quarterback. If Lamar Jackson's playing, I'm not even going anywhere near Mark Andrews. But to get a player who is coming off those back-to-back games, what's his targets been? It's been
13 and 11.
So he is catching a high percentage. That's the only worry that I would have is he's catching like 85% of the passes that he's seeing. But other than that, he's the clear number one guy. I think he's not. I don't think he's expensive enough, to be honest. At just $7K.
All right, John, is he your cash game guy too?
No, he's actually on my fade list. Devin and I are butting heads tonight. I actually like the rationale that it's Tyler Huntley driving a lot of it. The question is whether or not he can continue to be this consistent and, efficient is probably the better word. As Devin's talked about, 23 targets, he's caught 21 of those. And of those 21, 13% of them have been touchdowns. And oh, by the way, he's also gotten 100 yards each week, which gives him that 3-point bonus on DK. If he gets much above 10%, I'll be fading. I've got him somewhere around 5% entering Friday morning. The tight ends I'm looking at are Rob Gronkowski, 6,200, a bit cheaper. Some questions at the running back position there. We already talked about that. I like Gronk in cash games. We'll see how popular he gets for tournaments, and depending on how popular he gets, will really drive whether or not I think he's a great GPP player or not. And then we saw I think it was a week ago tonight that game actually played out where Donald Parham, it was a really kind of scary play. He's out, and Jared Cook I like against Houston. 3,500. He played well last week in Parham's absence. We know Donald Parham won't be back this week. He's the guy that if you're spending down, I think he's a decent cash game play. As far as tournaments go, who's the guy I always talk about, Devin?
James O'Shaughnessy.
No, not him. Not him.
Cole Kmet.
You said, yep, he's one of them. And then you said this other guy last week, and I was surprised because I didn't think I talked about him that much.
Fabian Moreau.
No, CJ Usama.
Oh yeah. I said throwback. You don't talk about him anymore, but yeah. I did mention that. So
in terms of tournaments, Cole Kmet and CJ are the two guys I'm looking at, both in that 3K threshold. I think both are actually very good plays when I see the early ownership percentages.
Yeah,
no Dallas Goedert at 5,100. Did I miss his name somewhere?
You did not miss his name, and it really, for me, he's right now. He's in that Thursday night threshold where I don't know where I'm going to land on him because it really depends on how popular he gets going into the weekend. Where does RotoGrinders have him in terms of ownership?
He's 16. Kelsey is 15 right now. That's in the assumption he plays, of course. And then Andrews at about 10. If Kelsey would come out, then I think Andrews and Goedert would definitely go up, and Gronk at 12%.
I'm a fan of Goedert at 10%. I'm fading him at 15%.
It's not that much difference.
That's the way it goes.
Okay. No O'Shaughnessy this week. I mean, you're going to jump off that train when you're ready to jump on the Jags.
I'm likely getting off that train this week. I think that there are better receivers on that Jags offense.
He already has 20% of Treadwell, so you can't have too much more Jags exposure.
This will be the week that Kyle Pitts goes off, and it's the week Phil is not on the show.
It's
so true. It's definitely going to happen, and it is against Detroit. So who knows? It might. All right, team defense. Before we wrap up the show this week, what's popping for you there, Devin?
Atlanta Falcons against whoever is starting for the Detroit Lions, down at $2,600. I think is probably going to be the most popular cash game play this week. The other defenses you could look at, maybe the Jags at 2,700. I know they looked really bad last week against Houston, but Zach Wilson has a tendency to turn the ball over quite a bit. And the Jags defense, if you look at it across the entire year, haven't been that bad. So those are the two that I'm looking at. I don't know that there's a defense that I'm like clamoring to spend up for. Maybe if Sam Darnold gets the start, you could make the case for the Bucs, but I don't even think I think they're too expensive for their pass defense struggling. So I'm paying down this week. And with no Joey Bosa, I'm not going to the Chargers against Houston either. So
I wouldn't hate the Seahawks against Justin Fields. Little turnover action there. Tough place to play on the road. 3K. I know Seattle's been terrible and they might be packing it in, but I just know Justin Fields is a turnover waiting to happen. So whether it's a fumble or an INT, I think Seattle's an interesting choice. John, what you got?
I like the other defense in that game, the Bears. In terms of what I'm seeing is they're second most likely on the entire board to reach GPP value, and they're going to be nowhere near as popular as some of the other defenses. And as you pointed out, Dan, are they mailing it in? They very well could be. A lot of questions with that offense. In Seattle, I like Chicago at 2,500. The other defense that I've written down and actually tops on my board, believe it or not, and this goes against some other things. So I hope people understand that I build a portfolio of teams rather than one or two GPPs. But the New England Patriots come out pretty high for me at 2,900 against Buffalo. Their likelihood to achieve GPP value versus their relative popularity is quite high. There's a pretty big differential there. So I'll be overweight on the Patriots this week, despite how much I actually like that game for GPPs.
All right. I think that covers most of the slate here, guys. Certainly appreciate all of you guys joining us here on the Power Grid. You can always find us over at Footballguys and RotoGrinders.com. Great tools for you if you are mass multi-entering. If you're playing some NBA Christmas Day slates, we got stuff for you there in the NBA. And of course, make sure you're checking out that Football Guys Twitter feed, and Dr. Gene, he's give you updates on any injury news that's going to be happening. So I'll tell you what, some of the very best in the business, you can find them both at Football Guys and RotoGrinders.com. Want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas. This will be our last show before the Christmas holiday. I'll be gone next week, but we'll return in 2 weeks after that. Devin, John, thank you guys so much. I am Dan, and good luck this week, and we'll talk to you next Thursday.